Hello, Chain Gang. Welcome back to the Four Chains and another edition of Top 5 Friday. So today's list is Top 5 television dramas. We'll put up a list here. These are the lists that we originally came up with. The group of Patreons took a sidebar. And if you've been watching the show, you know we've already done a few of these. If there's something on the list that you would like us to do sooner or later, go ahead and comment, or more importantly, if you have an idea we don't have on the list you want us to do, put that in the comments when we get ready to have your situation and we will give you a shout out. Today's shout out goes to Jim and Deborah. I think the reason why this got the most requests is because we are living in the golden age of television. There's only one show on this list that started after 1999, and I think that if I expanded the list and did top 50 television dramas, probably 46 or 47 of them will have started 1999 or less. So just be lucky that you're in this. You know, if you would have asked me before I started putting this together whether Breaking Bad is one of the 5 best TV shows of all time, I would have guessed yes instantly. I would have been like, yeah, of course it is. And it didn't make the cut. I guess you could say it would be number 6 if we expanded the list. That is just outrageous to me. I wouldn't be upset at you if you had Breaking Bad as the 2nd best show of all time. You know, separating best from favorite. Breaking Bad has a prequel called Better Call Saul. If somebody put that in the top 25 shows of all time, I wouldn't mind. We got like Rome. Rome is HBO's Rome. If you haven't seen that, that's the best TV show ever based on real events. Angie and I both loved Ozark. Actually, we love anything with Julia Garner is the actress. Americans, anything she does, you should watch. I love Deadwood, which is the show that the guys who did Game of Thrones did before that. You know, Handmaid's Tale. That's something that definitely wouldn't make this list, but it's just such a crazy show because it started out as a science fiction show with this huge flaw, which is that the premise is just so absurd it could never happen. And by the time it concluded, it was like this cautionary tale. Like, look at what's happening in the world today, guys. This is something that could actually happen. We need to wake up. So I think that, you know, it's just, we're lucky to be watching TV. Guilty pleasure shows that you love to watch but wouldn't be considered great, like Sons of Anarchy, or my wife's favorite guilty pleasure show is Black Sails. We love this show on Banshee, which not a lot of people saw, which is on Cinemax for 3 seasons. I mean, these are not great shows today, but I think if any of those shows were aired prior to Hill Street Blues, people would think that was the best show ever. So be lucky that you know, you are where you are. I want to get into this list. I want to get done with this list because I want to troll myself for not putting Breaking Bad in the top 5. That's just insane. Number 5 is The Sopranos. I mean, I guess that's the thing. If I'm going to put Breaking Bad in the top 5, that means Sopranos isn't. And in the end, I think that there is no Breaking Bad without The Sopranos, and that's the tiebreaker. I think that, I mean, I bet you Aaron Paul and Bryan Cranston would say that that's true. So Sopranos firmly in number 5. Like Breaking Bad, like the first couple seasons were good, but not GOAT territory. And then in season 3, they really got there. And it was just absolutely off to the races. I spent a lot of time researching this, and I noticed that a lot of critics feel that Hill Street Blues is the most influential show of all time. I see that argument, but I would actually argue that maybe it's Sopranos, and I'll tell you why. There is a 12-year gap between the end of Hill Street Blues and the beginning of The Sopranos. And think of all, The Sopranos is the show I talked about that started in 1999 that's on this list. The rest of the shows come after that, except for one. And look at the flood of shows since The Sopranos that were influenced by The Sopranos that came out. Maybe television historians will say, well, what about Oz? Oz is a show a lot of people watching this haven't seen. I'm not saying you should see it. It was considered edgy and good at the time, but it just doesn't hold up today. It was very dark, and the ratings weren't fantastic, and it wasn't the cultural sensation that Sopranos is. So Sopranos is what created these shows. I would say that the only show between Hill Street Blues and Sopranos that was like truly great that you would, came before Sopranos, so you have to give it credit for, is NYPD Blue. But NYPD Blue was a lot of people from Hill Street Blues, Dennis Franz and David Caruso and stuff. And like NYPD Blue, the other shows that were influenced by Hill Street were kind of tamer versions of it. Like, hey, Hill Street worked really great. We want to incorporate all those changes that they made in the genre, but hey, let's change this and this, make it more palatable to a wider audience. And a lot of those shows did get higher ratings than Hill Street Blues, so I guess it worked. But Sopranos being on HBO gives it a lot more content leeway, and I think that's why, in my opinion, it's actually more influential. The acting, some of the people like Edie Falco, if you rewatch it, weren't as, it's almost sacrilegious to say so, weren't as great in the beginning of the show as they would become. She wound up winning 3 Emmys. James Gandolfini, who was great from step one playing Tony Soprano, he won 3 Emmys as well. Michael Imperioli won an Emmy for playing Christopher. Adrian Dre Matteo, I think I'm pronouncing that right, won for playing Adriana Lacerca. Joe Pantoliani, he's just this great heel persona. If you saw the movie Bound, he's the villain in that, and he's just so great. He won an Emmy for playing, you can flame me if I get the characters wrong, but Ralph Ciprietti, Ralph Cipriani, whatever. Steve Buscemi came the next season. He won an Emmy for playing Tony Blundetto. The big criticism of Sopranos is the last episode, and I get it. It's arguably, a lot of people say it's the worst final episode in the history of television. I don't think it was, but I think that The Sopranos had set such a high bar, it maybe was the worst episode in relation to all the other shows in The Sopranos. But I would say that the argument for The Sopranos is they didn't really have bad shows. Like entries number 4, 3, and 2 were great, but they had shows that were not so great. The Sopranos, other than the final episode, didn't really have that. I would say that in the end, the reason why it's 5 and not ahead of 4 and 3 and 2 is that the best episodes of the shows we're about to talk about were exponentially better than The Sopranos. Now, Sopranos supporters would say, well, they're gangsters, they're not good guys. That's true, but, you can make a show about whatever you want, and I think that the characters, although we empathize with them, not at the level that we did on the shows that we're going to talk about. I mean, Tony Soprano was the character that you empathize with the most, but, he was a killer, he was a criminal, he was an adulterer, he was a mean kind of bully guy a lot of the time. He had some aspects of his personality that were, his character that were endearing, but like all the rest of the characters, you couldn't get enough emotionally involved with them to be moved on the level that successive shows would done. And a good example of that is number 4. Number 4 is The Walking Dead. If you took the 10 worst episodes of The Walking Dead and compared them to 10 worst episodes of The Sopranos, if you're judging on that, The Sopranos has to be ranked higher. But if you took the best 10 episodes of The Walking Dead, it is significantly better than The Sopranos for the reason that we just talked about. If you are objecting to this and you have not seen the show, it's because you just can't believe a show about zombies could be better than The Sopranos. Let me just clear that up right off the bat. The Walking Dead's not about zombies. If you love Shawshank Redemption, you will love The Walking Dead. Frank Darabont, with both situations, in this situation, he used the zombies the same way he uses the prison in Shawshank or like the Green Mile as a dramatic device. It strips away all of the modern amenities. If you're young, you don't know that in the generation before you, human beings would talk to each other and they would have discussions in person and they would go outside. And so human emotions were different. Human interaction was different before all of this technology. And what Frank Darabont wants to do in things like Shawshank and Walking Dead is use a situation, that reduces this to just raw human emotion. And that's why the scenes are just so unbelievably moving. This show is great from episode 1. The only reason we watched it, we usually don't watch shows until they get some history and we know that they're going to be good. But I read a review in the Washington Post style section, another message for people who are younger. Like, news used to come in this setup of paper, and it would have articles, and it would show up at your door. You know what? This is too complicated. Don't worry about that. Let's just say that I saw this style section review, and the whole cover of it was this new show I'd never heard of, The Walking Dead. And it got my attention because they usually don't devote that much time to a television review. And the first paragraph was, "This is the greatest show I've seen in many years," and we decided to watch it. Angie never would have watched it if it was a zombie show, but it's this amazing first episode where the most significant thing that's ever happened on planet Earth has just happened. And Rick, the lead protagonist, wakes up from a coma, and thus we get to discover what happened to the planet along with him, and it's just a great device. Season 2 is where it really grew an audience. The audience grew through word of mouth. It was one of those situations. By season 2, episode 7, it was the highest rated show on cable television, which was significant at the time because for a decade or so, the highest rated show on cable had always been, pro wrestling. That episode 7 in season 2, is the episode where they discover all of the walkers in the barn on the farm, and they decide to funnel them out and dispatch them, I guess humanely is the best word. And, let me just say this. I'm going to walk the line, and I might not do a great job. I'm assuming most people watching this have seen most of these shows. But if you haven't, I'm going to try to talk about episodes in a way that will remind you of them without completely ruining them for people who haven't seen them. But, the last thing we see is Sophia, we haven't seen Sophia, Carol's daughter, for a long time. And Carol's heartbreak was so profound, and a lot of credit goes to Melissa McBride and all the other actors for creating this scene. But all of a sudden, we were experiencing profound grief in a way we'd never seen before on television. Just something about the way they set it up. And audience were moved in a way that it was just different, and there was no going back. Shane was played by John Bernthal. If you haven't watched the show, you've seen John Bernthal. He wound up starring in I saw him in a Martin Scorsese movie. He's been in a ton of stuff. He had a show called The Equalizer on Netflix, but his last episode was episode 12 of that season, and it seemed like it was going to be Rick's episode. And I guess I only bring that up because The Walking Dead was the most unpredictable show ever. I know Game of Thrones had some unpredictable moments, but The Walking Dead was unpredictable almost every episode, and it just kept you on toes the way that it just had never happened before. Episode 2 ends in a way that was, I guess, less satisfying to me than people who read the comic books, which I didn't. Herschel's farm is done, and then all of a sudden we have this random shot in the woods, and we see this female badass with a couple of katanas, and the comic book fans apparently lost their mind, but looking back in retrospect, it's definitely a goosebump moment. Season 3 is where it just became a national sensation. It went from being the highest rated show on television. The second highest rated show on television became The Talking Dead, which was basically a therapy session of people talking about The Walking Dead after The Walking Dead ended. And it was basically just the whole country kind of commiserating around, the 5 people here. And if you didn't watch the show, you just don't understand. It sounds crazy that could be the second highest rated show on television, but it was. Actually, The Walking Dead became the highest rated, not just on cable television, but became the first cable television show to be the highest rated show on all of television. It also became the second show to ever have a season where every single episode got higher ratings. The only other one that had done it, I believe, was the Dallas season with Who Shot JR. Episode 4 of season 3 was, up until that point, but no longer, as you're going to see, the best show in the history of television. You know, kids in modern society and industrialized society without war and stuff get to grow up gradually, and it's a wonderful thing nobody appreciates. But boy, in the world of The Walking Dead, kids got to grow up pretty fast. And the epitome of that is Carl. When Carl's he's got his mom Lori there, and she's just had a cesarean, and the circumstances mean that he has to make a choice that you would never want a child to make. But in these situations, the child has to make that choice, and it was just another one of those moving moments. I think that leads me to kind of what really makes it unique, in that the villains and the heroes in The Walking Dead were more nuanced than we'd ever seen before or since, because the world, the circumstances force heroes to do very villainous things from time to time, and forced villains to actually do things that were heroes. I remember Merle, which is Daryl's brother. Shane, you know, Shane was a terrible villain, but a hero at times. Gabriel started as a villain, then became a hero. The governor, I don't know if he was really a hero, but what a villain. Gareth at Terminus. Dawn, not a lot of people remember Dawn, but she was at the hospital, and she's the person that, what she did to Beth, unbelievable. And the actress who played Beth after that came on The Talking Dead and talked about it, and that was almost as moving as the show. I remember the wolves were scary villains. The Whisperers with Alpha and Beta, all very complicated heroes and villains. And of course, I'm putting off the discussion of the villain who, certainly the greatest non-Game of Thrones villain ever. He is the person who both destroyed the show and ensured that it would be on lists like this. And we'll just go right to it, the season 7 premiere. In that field, all the heroes are kneeling down, and we see Negan, and he introduces Lucille, which is his weapon of choice, which I actually used at a team meeting once to wake up my crew. The characters, I'll try to tread lightly here, but the characters that left us last night, it was such an emotional situation that newspapers actually had obituaries for fictional characters the next day. In particular, well, I guess I shouldn't say which characters, but I don't think anybody would say it was a terrible episode, but it was so over-the-top disturbing that The Walking Dead set the record for the biggest rating drop between episodes. See, it's episode 1 of season 7 and episode 2, and it never got those ratings back from season 7, episode 1. And it was just, despite the 1-hour Talking Dead therapy session afterwards, it was just so difficult to deal with that a lot of people left it. And that is why it is number 4, and below number 3, I guess, I don't know, it just seemed like a good transition, is the aforementioned Hill Street Blues. If I was judging TV shows the way I judge athletes, Hill Street Blues would be number 1, because the gap between Hill Street Blues and the second best show was a larger gap than there's ever been in the history of television between the best show and the second best show. It was so different, so revolutionary. You might not think that if you've never seen it, and this video prompts you to go watch Hill Street Blues, because so many of the things that Hill Street Blues introduced are now standard fare, are now the norm for shows. But it was just absolutely, revolutionary at the time. It won 27 Emmys. It won Best Drama the first 4 years. And they won so many Emmys their first 4 seasons, there started to be a backlash. And all of a sudden they were losing Emmys they should have won. And that might sound unfair to you, but let me give you some perspective. In 1987, all 5, I think it was 87, you can correct me in the comments if I'm wrong, all 5 of the Best Supporting Actor nominees in the Emmys were from Hill Street Blues. So that's basically just huge dominations. It won a bunch of Emmys for writing, but the acting is what sets it apart. Daniel Travanti was the lead. He won multiple Emmys. So did Betty Thomas, and so did Michael Conrad. Michael Conrad, the actor, passed away in the show. He was replaced with what a lot of people feel is one of the top 5 theater actors of all time. His name is Robert Prosky, but Michael Conrad's the guy who said, "Be careful out there" at the end of each episode. Greatest line ever in television, probably. It's hard to win Emmys when you're competing against each other. Bruce Weitz won an Emmy, Alfred Woodward won an Emmy, Barbara Babcock won an Emmy, but they were just dominating all the categories. You got to look at who didn't win the Emmys. We talked about Dennis Franz and David Caruso, who went on to do NYPD Blue. They weren't nominated. They didn't win any Emmys. I don't know about nominated, but they didn't win any Emmys for Hill Street. But David Caruso was nominated for NYPD Blue. He won the Golden Globe for NYPD Blue. Dennis Franz was nominated for Best Actor 8 years in a row on NYPD Blue. He won half of those years. Let's talk about, I wrote them down here. Let's talk about some other actors that didn't win on Hill Street Blues. Ken Olin, he did not win, but he went to 30-something and he won for that. He also has another Emmy because he is the showrunner, the creator of This Is Us. Jeffrey Tambor didn't win for Hill Street, but he's won 2 Emmys for Transparent. Cuba Gooding Jr. won an Oscar for Show Me the Money in Jerry Maguire. Frances McDormand was incredible on Hill Street Blues. Didn't win an Emmy, but she did win 4 Academy Awards after that. Danny Glover, Don Cheadle, Tim Robbins. Both of the stars of Terminator win it. Linda Hamilton and Michael Biehn were in Hill Street Blues. Mimi Rogers. I mean, you get the idea. Whoever cast that show, basically every single person who was on that show became a big star. But let's talk about what I referenced before is what made Hill Street Blues different. Before Hill Street Blues, and if you're of a certain age, you've probably forgotten this, but when I tell you, you'll remember it. Every television show, comedy, drama, didn't matter, was a standalone episode. If you missed an episode of Columbo or Beretta or whatever, it didn't matter because each one had a standalone plot. You could just pick it up the next week. Hill Street Blues is the show that started the multiple story arcs. Other shows, once in a blue moon, they had done like a to be continued, so a 2-story arc, but Hill Street Blues did 3-episode arcs, 6-episode arcs, even arcs that went over multiple seasons. Now everybody does that, but it was different. Also, they handled a lot of dark subjects that it's like they wanted the show to be canceled. Drug addiction, divorce, homosexuality, cross-dressing, very, dark main characters. Main characters in shows were always just flat out good people and heroes, and this was not Batman and Robin. And it didn't spell ratings at first. As a matter of fact, Hill Street has the record for the lowest ratings for a show in season 1 that ever got renewed for season 2. They don't still have that rating, but they did at the time. NBC realized they had something special. Well, of course, the Emmys went really well, but they wanted to support this. They knew it was a prestige item, and they did what has become standard practice, which is stacking one particular night to build up a show. And the lead into Hill Street was Cosby Show, Family Ties, Cheers, and Night Court. But, they made an investment and it paid off because Hill Street got an audience after that. Let's talk about number 2, which is The Wire. I know why, The Wire's, I've seen The Wire number 1 on some lists. I've seen it a lot further down with that. And I think the people who rank it lower, it's because, I know why it is. It's because they had this incredible season 1 that was great from the start. Got critics freaking out, got people talking on the street about it. And it was about the streets and the drug trade in particular of Baltimore. But the original concept of the season was to always be about Baltimore and have some connecting threads, but have each season be a standalone subject matter. And season 2 was about the shipping docks. It wasn't terrible, but everybody will tell you it's terrible because it was certainly terrible in compared to how great season 1 is. They got the message. Starting with season 3, they went back to the streets, and it definitely worked out. The Sopranos and The Wire flip-flop on lists all the time. They get compared a lot. The difference is that the best episodes of the difference is the same as the difference with all these other shows. The best episodes of The Wire are so much better. Let me talk about a few. Season 1, episode 10, there's this great episode. there's not a lot I can say without giving it away, but Avon and Stringer Bell and Weebay decide, hey, we got to deal with this Omar situation. If you've seen it, you know who Omar is. Wow, that actor left us way too soon, but it's the kind of tension that you see in a movie. A couple episodes later in that season is Wallace's last episode, which just is the first episode that brought audience to tears. And I remember the critics going, hey, I don't know who this Michael P. Jordan guy is. He probably should come up with a different name. But boy, oh boy, he came from nowhere and he was so talented. He's not from nowhere now. Michael Jordan has had a lot of episodes since then. I'm just going to hit a couple other episodes. Season 3, episode 11 is Stringer Bell's last episode. Stringer Bell was played by an unknown actor named Idris Elba, who is certainly not unknown anymore. I would say that at this point, it was the greatest episode in television history. Stringer's denouement was not even the best part about it. That's the crazy thing. There was this unbelievable moment where Brother Mouzone, who'd been hired to kill Omar, meets Omar in the alley and they have a standoff, and the goosebumps are just absolutely off the charts. If you'd have told me after that episode, you'll never see a better moment in a television show ever, I certainly would have believed you. Thank goodness, we've been blessed with better episodes. Season 4 ends with a couple episodes that are almost as good as that. Episode 12, Bubbles' drug vials are borrowed by a friend, and that becomes a heartbreaking scene. That actor is so great, and you just know he's never going to get over it, and it's just incredibly moving. And in fact, I believe in episode 13 is when he tries to makes a suicide attempt. Episode 13 is also the last episode for Bodhi. Season 5, the final season, is not as good as seasons 1 or 3 or 4, but season 5 has an episode that I have to mention. It's where Omar walks into the convenience store and turns around and sees that kid. So if you haven't seen The Wire, just understand this. I'm saying it's better than Breaking Bad, The Sopranos, The Walking Dead, and Hill Street Blues. I want you to understand what a significant statement that is. If you haven't seen The Wire, see it. When I talk about those other shows, I'm saying it's better. This is a subjective list. You may be able to convince me to switch any of those shows around. I might not agree, but I probably would see your point. When your shows are that great, people like different things. There's a lot of violence in these shows, and some of the content might sway people to put one over the other. In general, entertainment is subjective, but subjectiveness has its limits. My favorite band is Styx. They're the ones I listen to the most. That does not mean that I'm entitled to my own opinion and I can say that Styx is better than the Beatles. There is subjectiveness that only goes so far, and if I said something like that, it would be just wrong. And on those lines, if you think that Game of Thrones is not the best television show in the history of television, you're just wrong. I'm sorry, I know it makes me sound like a jerk. You can flame me in the comments, but I just feel like this one is not up to interpretation. I'm going to make my argument here. A lot of people, I think the people who've seen it who don't think it's number one, say that because of how the last season ended. They tend to say, that whole last season was crap. It wasn't. There were some great episodes in it. But the second to last episode was very unpleasant to watch. Daenerys' choices once she finally reaches King's Landing. I get that. Angie and I have seen the first 7 seasons, seen the 8th season twice and the first 7 seasons 3 times. The reason is because we got in the habit of every time a new season was going to start, we would watch the old season right before it. And obviously there's no season coming after season 8, so we didn't have to watch season 8 again. But recently, with House of Dragon coming out, we did go back and watched it straight through episode 1 through through the end of season 8. And I will say this, when you see it again, you will understand Daenerys' choices better. They'll still be unpleasant to watch, but you will understand them better. My biggest criticism of Game of Thrones is different than that. My biggest criticism is their unneeded sense of urgency in moving the story along. There were 73 episodes of Game of Thrones, and there really needed to be at least 80, and I'll tell you why. This world was really well imagined. Now, it gets too much credit for its originality. If you read The Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire by Edward Gibbon, a lot of these groups and scenarios will start to seem a little bit more familiar and less original, but Shakespeare borrowed an enormous amount from the Roman Empire too, so, you know, it's fair game. But he did just create this world that was just amazing to be a part of. I will watch every Game of Thrones spinoff that they can possibly throw at me because of that. I mean, it was just wonderful to watch these characters travel through the worlds and just be part of this Lord of the Rings type adventure. But towards the end, they needed to wrap it up, and, you know, journeys that would take seasons were all of a sudden taking episodes. All of a sudden, Daenerys is going from Dragonstone to Beyond the Wall in what seemed like a couple of hours. To me, that's the biggest criticism. But is that enough of a criticism to rank it number 2? No, it's not. Well, obviously I don't feel that way. I think the gap, oh my God, would we be blessed if a show comes around that I'm willing to rank in front of Game of Thrones. But the gap between Game of Thrones and whatever you would consider the second best show ever is enormous. And here's a way of demonstrating it. I believe that Game of Thrones, because, you know, with sports, I can come up with this Gretzky stat like in the last video to really emphasize why he's so much better than number 2. This is my sort of deal with Game of Thrones. If you only counted the 9th episode of the first 6 seasons, gave Game of Thrones that handicap, it would still be the greatest show in the history of television by a lot. Sounds crazy. First, there was no 9th episode in season 7 and 8, so that's why I say first 6 seasons. But if that sounds crazy, hear me out. Let's go over them real quick. Season 1, episode 9 was Baylor. This is the episode that shocked the world. There's a lot of theater actors in Game of Thrones. There wasn't any movie stars. Some people maybe have seen Peter Dinklage before, but in terms of movie stars, the only one was Sean Bean, who had starred in the aforementioned Lord of the Rings. We assumed the Game of Thrones was Sean Bean or Ned Stark, the character's name, saga. In episode 9 of season 1, he decides to make a false confession to save his children, and, you know, Joffrey doesn't really play game, let's just say that. Nobody saw the episode of that coming, not me. I get a lot of things ruined for me because I figure stuff out, and so shocking moments aren't so shocking to me. Definitely not the case with Ned Stark. Season 2, episode 9, The Battle of Blackwater. At that point, it was the most spectacular battle we'd ever seen on television. It's the one where Stannis Baratheon brings his fleet into King's Landing, and he's got the King's Landing, you know, outnumbered by a lot. Joffrey says he's going to take charge, maybe not so much, but Tyrion counters with wildfire. Season 3, episode 9 is The Reigns of Castamere. For you giant fans, you now have goosebumps. There is a great scene where the party that's protecting Bran is holed up in the towers, and all of a sudden the Wildlings show up, and they're discovered because Hodor is a little bit too loud, and Bran is forced to use his warg powers to help them survive, and it still looks like it's not going to happen, but Jon Snow shows up and starts vanquishing Wildlings, but of course, he cannot vanquish Ygritte, his true love. If you think that they did a great job acting out their love, well, they did, but the love is real and they're still together. He couldn't put an arrow in her, so he flees. Egret, who is hurt that he has taken the side of his compatriots and not the wildlings, proceeds to dump a bunch of arrows in his back because, of course, Jon Snow knows nothing. But the real reason that this episode is a worldwide sensation and huge fans have goosebumps now is because although it is officially called The Rains of Castamere, the world now knows it as The Red Wedding. Not going to continue that explanation. Season 4, Episode 9 is The Watchers on the Wall, an even more spectacular battle than we saw with Stannis. It's when the wildlings are attacking the wall, another badly numbered out situation. Their trump card is not Tyrion, it's Jon Snow, and he's running through wildlings like butter, but of course the one he can't run through is Egret. That is the moment, that is the episode where Egret tells Jon that he knows nothing for the final time. Not getting emotional about a freaking show about dragons on camera for you guys. You can forget about that. Let's digress a little and talk about how incredible that season 4 ending was. The episode before this that we're talking about was The Mountain and the Viper. If you know, you know. The episode after it was called The Children. We see the children for the first time. They have to rescue Bran and Hodor and that whole crew from the Whites. The Whites were the things that were coming up out of the snow. It has this incredible moment where it looks like the wildlings are turning the tide on the Night's Watch, and Stannis Baratheon shows up with his army and turns the tide. It is the same, I can't believe this is all in the same episode. It's the episode where Brienne of Tarth has the sword fight with the Hound in front of Arya. And it ends with Jaime Lannister, a horrible villain up until this point, but realizes that Tyrion could not possibly have killed what we know is his son Joffrey. He goes to set Tyrion free. He does so. Tyrion decides to visit his ex-girlfriend and his dad, who are in the same place. And his dad picked the wrong time to take a shit. Let's just leave it at that. Let's go to season 5, episode 9's Dance of the Dragon. Jorah Mormont. Has anybody ever loved anybody more than Jorah Mormont loved Daenerys? He shows up, fights in the tournament to get back in the good graces, and then he has an even better opportunity to get in her good graces when the Sons of the Harpy reveal themselves and start slaughtering the entire crowd with the object of getting to Daenerys. And, Jorah Mormont is not going to be enough to defend her, but, Drogon is. And Drogon shows up, and that's just another great moment. In this same episode, Jaime convinces his daughter's captors to let her go, and he gets her on the ship. But unfortunately, before she gets on the ship, she decides to accept a kiss goodbye from her captors. It's also the show where Stannis, how do I put this, makes a very large sacrifice involving his daughter to try to ingratiate himself with the Lord of Light. And time will only tell how that's going to play out. Season 5 also ended well, like season 4. It became the highest rated show. It's called Hard Home by viewers in IMDb history. In episode 1, from episode 1, season 1, we've been told that winter is coming. This is the episode where winter comes. If you remember, it's where Jon Snow goes to convince the wildlings, hey, I know you just attacked us and almost killed us, but we need you to come back behind the wall because we need every last man to fight this army of the dead, and we need to go now. He starts to convince them when the army of the dead shows up, and the White Walkers are literally just tumbling down the mountain after them. It's just such a startling visual sight. The wildlings and Jon Snow do their best, but barely make it into boats. And then there's that moment where you think maybe it's a moment for celebration, and the king of the army of the dead raises his hands, and you realize, oh, this guy has an ability that is going to be very difficult to combat. It's just such a feeling of dread. It's just an absolutely astonishing situation. The episode after this is this just unbelievable scene where Stannis attacks the Boltons. Cersei's walk of shame, I guess we could say. And then the final image is Jon Snow in the snow and his own blood, paying the price for breaking his vows to the Ninth Watch. The last episode 9 is still, and I'm guessing, unless I get really lucky, unless the world gets lucky, will go down as the greatest episode of any show in the history of television, and it was called The Battle of the Bastards. There's this incredibly satisfying scene where all of the masters of the towns where Daenerys has, all the slave masters, she has conquered them and freed their slaves and taken them away. They all get their armies together and team up and attack Daenerys at Meereen. And they have this meeting where they ask for her surrender. And she says, "Oh, I thought I was here to take your surrender." And they kind of laugh because they have her outnumbered 1,000 to 1. But she has them outnumbered as far as dragons are concerned. And it's just so satisfying to watch. But it wasn't even the most satisfying moment of the show. This is the battle between Ramsay Bolton, just the biggest piece of crap ever, his army and Jon Snow's army, and it is the most emotional battle in the history of entertainment. I said entertainment very carefully. I don't mean television, I mean all of entertainment. There have been some spectacular battles, obviously, Saving Private Ryan and stuff like that, but there has never been a battle that has been more emotionally wrenching and gripping and more of an emotional roller coaster ride than this one. Ramsay was such a horrible, horrible villain, or great villain, depending on how you're talking, and just the way he treated Sansa. I'm one of these people that's just like, you hurt women or you hurt kids, like, no. And just the way he treated Theon, I guess the way he treated everybody was just so sadistic and horrible. And when the tide turns and Sansa gets put in charge of his fate, her choices are something that I would hope most good people would find repugnant. But in this situation, I really doubt anybody did. The last episode of that season is the Winds of Winter. It is the only other show with a 9.9 on IMDb. This is the episode where Cersei decides, instead of facing her punishment at the hands of those religious guys in the Sept of Baelor, the Seven or whatever it is, I can't remember. She decides, instead of her paying them a visit, Wildfire's going to pay them a visit. The second most satisfying part of it is when Arya breaks into Lord Walter Frey's castle. And she gets in there with one of her disguises of the Faceless Men. But eventually she decides she wants Walter Frey to see her real face and see that it's Arya, as she retaliates for the Red Wedding. And it was like the most satisfying thing in the history of television until the next scene, which is where we see Jon Snow's backstory completed. We know about his true parentage now. And we know he is not a Snow or a bastard, and I'll leave it at that. Listen, essentially all we've discussed is episode 9s. There's episodes, I guess I could mention a bunch more great ones. You mentioned in the comment, if there's a great episode you think I should have mentioned, put it in the comments, please. I know that there's some great episode I shouldn't mention. I'm going to mention just 2 more real quick. Season 3, episode of 4. It's not the best episode. It's not Battle of the Bastards, but it's the most satisfying for me at the time. I have a wife. I have 2 daughters that they've created in me that's just horrible, horrible feminist, but I just really don't like men who mistreat women, and I love powerful women. And this is called "And Now His Watch Is Ended," and it refers to Commander Mormont, and that will have applications later. But what I'm talking about is when the slave masters of Astapor are under the impression that they are selling an army of the Unsullied to Daenerys in exchange for her largest dragon. And they assume she doesn't speak Valyrian, and they are saying things about her that would not fly in the Me Too age. But Daenerys does speak Valyrian, and she heard every word and decides to alter the deal. And she lets them know she speaks Valerian by entering one word, which is Dracarys. Okay, I just want to mention one more episode. Let me try to see if I can research which one it is. Season 6, episode 5. And the name of that episode is The Door. You know, the character of Hodor just seems like a lovable goof that kind of has to be tolerated and accommodated, and is probably the most irrelevant character on the show up until this episode, where you realize that, I guess what it is that, you know, I was in a plane crash, I was in a terrible car accident, I was in the upper deck at Candlestick Park during Game 3 of the World Series when that earthquake hit. I've had a lot of close calls, and when a lot of people, when they have that, they think, hey, maybe maybe I was spared for a reason. And Hodor was spared for this episode. And the best heroic moment that we've seen in any show ever. And if you've seen pictures of Hodor, but you haven't seen this episode, you probably think that's not a superhero, but I would say that superheroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they just hold the door. Okay, we're ending this. I ain't doing this. Okay, listen guys, I just love television, and I love you for watching, and I really appreciate you tuning in. Let us know what list you want to see next, and if it's one that I can be emotionless about, I'll go ahead and give it a shot, and we'll see you next time on The Four Chains.